Welcome to Never Rewrite. I'm Isaac Askew.
And I'm Jeffrey Sherman. And today we're joined by Dustin Rea, head of Red Hook Agency. And he's going to talk with us about he's going to continue. It's a check in. We've talked before with him before about White Label CRM, which is not the real name of the company. And we're going to check in to see how their iterative refactoring is doing. And again, the transparency disclosure, I've worked with Dustin and Isaac in the past, but I don't work with them now. But Dustin and Isaac are working together on the White Label CRM project. So Dustin, when last we spoke, you'd gotten White Label up into AWS, and they had they had gone from one server, 1 DB on-prem to cloud, and then you were struggling to move them into multiple servers because there was some kind of file uploading. So I guess let's go from there. How is the scaling going?
Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about that. Scaling, I think, so we did have some scaling issues even when we got onto AWS. There were, we had to essentially, there were peak times and kind of valley times from the usage perspective. So what we had to do was essentially overscale all of the resources in order to kind of account for the scale. That was kind of one issue that we were dealing with. User files was another kind of issue that prevented getting into kind of a horizontal scaling solution. What was happening was we had users uploading files for things like emails, logos, invoices, different PDFs, stuff like that would be uploaded to the server. And it was getting onto the server directly. So if we wanted to scale the server horizontally, all of the code that accessed those files needed to be able to access that file system, which means we would have to replicate those files across all of the servers, which would just be kind of a bigger technical challenge than we wanted to take on. So we needed to find a solution for that.
What'd you
Isaac
decide?
and his team kind of, yeah, so Isaac, I'll definitely let Isaac kind of jump into the technical solution some, but from a high level, we wanted to basically get those files off of the server so we could kind of delineate the responsibility there. I think we used Elastic File Storage, I think is the service name in AWS to end up doing that. Yeah, Isaac, you want to talk about the solution a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, there were a couple of routes to go. We were thinking about first moving the files to S3, but that would require us refactor a lot of the areas that were uploading and reading. Like before, it was uploading and reading to the server. This would have to upload and read from S3. And there are a lot of areas. This is a legacy application with a lot of different areas that are uploading and setting files. And so we did some initial analysis to see how long it would take to do it that way. So we had some people go look through the code and see, do I think it's going to be 20 hours, 40 hours, 60 hours? I think we came up to 20 to 30 hours of work probably to refactor it that way. And then we looked at other solutions. One of them was EFS, which was basically just mounting a directory and putting the files in that directory instead and sharing that between the instances. And that solution looked to be a lot less, just copying it over and mounting that directory. There's a cost difference between the two. EFS does cost more over time than S3 does, but not enough to offset the amount of hours that would be sunk into the refactoring. So it's still like something we may want to do in the future if it becomes cost prohibitive or people start uploading a ton more files for some other reason. But for now, it was a good solution to go ahead and get us to the point where we could scale horizontally.
I love that.
And then
Going with the
we'll go from there.
simpler, even though it's less cost-effective solution to get you to fix the actual problem, which is the horizontal scaling, rather than worrying about the longer term of that's a good. Having too many files is a good problem because it means you've got too many customers.
There's also this concept of even if you lose some money because it was a slightly more expensive solution than AWS, if we can scale horizontally such that our main EC2 instance can be downsized because it's massively over provisioned now, and we'll probably save a lot more money on that end with a smaller instance scaled horizontally and not have to worry too much. It would be like drop in a bucket comparatively to the S3 costs that we would have been saving.
So is it still running just one giant EC2 instance and one giant database?
Yeah, I mean, we have readers on the DB. So we have some, I guess, you might call that a second, DB in a sense. but yeah, I mean, we've split a lot of things there. I think the same thing with the DB and the EC2, right? We have to essentially quadruple scale what we would normally need from like 90% of the day because the morning rush for the user base is just so high. So pretty much all of the usage for the day comes in that short window of time. I have a strong feeling since a lot of the users work in that time, a lot of the automations and like triggers that they can create are probably also set to run in that time.
Mm-hmm.
So there's probably even additional load to like as the day starts, it's like the software is ramping up, it's sending out emails, it's sending texts, it's doing all these things. So there's just a really heavy load in the morning. We have no way to kind of scale up and then scale back down to get that cost down. So that's kind of what we're working on now.
Yeah, that's an interesting trade-off. Where if your business is very spiky, getting yourself to a position where you can scale up and down would be way more effective. Could be way more effective, I guess, right? Because who knows if it's. But yeah, that's an interesting thing. Because yeah, if you've only got one server, then you have to provision for the maximum load time.
Yeah, I think that there's a cautionary tale there too for
Mm-hmm.
software owners, right? And the cautionary tale is you need to set up your pricing structure for like these kinds of mistakes and kind of overages, right? Because at a certain point of scale, we needed to be able to provide the service because now all of these businesses are depending on it. And
Mm-hmm.
if the tech is now costing more than we are expecting, there's essentially a burn there, right? And you have to have a way to get out of that burn and trajectory, before running out of money. So
Yes.
just throwing money at the problem to kind of scale up the server allowed us to continue service, but it's not like in a state where we can live there forever in that kind of quadruply over provisioned state. It's just too expensive.
Right. So if throwing money at a problem works in a burst, but it doesn't work long term, I think is what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah. There's a risk there of how much can you take on, right? It's a trade off.
Right. And I think that gets to the other question or the other major thing that was going on when last we spoke, which is guys were stuck in kind of bug hell where
Hmm.
you having to fix bugs kind of is the number one thing because you're providing the service, but that was also blocking you from being able to do the feature work to get the costs under control. How has
Right.
that been going with the bug hell?
Yeah. So we'll talk about bug hell. What we were defining as bug hell is we had 200 and something known user reported bugs that we had confirmed at the time.
Wow. And have how
So
many
we're
customers?
I'm not sure what the exact customer count. It's in the hundreds. So hundreds of customers, probably in the thousands of users, around that ballpark. Um, it's a high ratio of bugs per users, right?
Right.
Churn was
That's what I was
high.
thinking. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, churn was very high due to that. And just you just lost user trust because people are depending on the service to operate their business. And if it's not dependable, then they'll leave. We're now under 100 bugs. So I wouldn't say we're completely out of the woods yet, but it feels like we've got a grapple on the situation. Churn is the lowest it's ever been. So I
Nice.
think that's a good sign. But yeah, I think that was one thing. So one of the things I think it's important both on what we just talked about with the costs and the kind of the owner and manager of the business kind of understanding like what they're kind of signing up for. It's the same thing when it comes to product requirements. So one of the things that we noticed with the bugs, like the first thing we did when you're looking at 250 bugs in Jira, it's just like overwhelming. So we said, okay, let's try to group these into categories and find the problem areas. And then what we did is kind of divide the team into pods to attack the problem areas and to develop some kind of like ownership and to really like bolster the tribal knowledge within those specific problem areas because the way that the team was set up, all of the tribal knowledge was sitting within just a small portion of the team. So the rest of the team, they weren't really able to kind of triage and fix bugs on their own. So we needed to pair those kind of historical knowledge people up with the rest of the team and kind of create groups. So doing that in a kind of divide and conquer method is what kind of got us there. And then back to the product requirements, the big thing was there was several features where they were kind of illogical, like UX experiences or just kind of where the features didn't really work together well in the workflow that the user's trying to do. So being able to kind of make sure all of those flows actually make sense and remove like illogical choices, both reduced like a burden on the support and it reduced our bug count. because there were several bugs where we were able to even just close the bug out because, it's not necessarily a bug. It's just the user misunderstanding how to use the software, which is a UX problem on our end. But we kind of like fixed the bug through support and then, made a ticket on our end to actually fix the issue in the UX of the application. So there's kind of a two-pronged approach there.
Wow, I love all of that, and I took some notes because I want to I want to go on different flows there. So one thing you just said was that you kind of changed the culture to better distribute knowledge, where it, if I'm reading between the lines right and guessing, it sounded like there were kind of the older original developers who kind of had all the knowledge of the system, or like the core knowledge. And then there were more recent developers, and they would only have limited knowledge of whatever they'd been working on so far, but there hadn't been any, I guess, great effort to train them on the system, or maybe the system didn't have consistent thinking throughout. Could you? So
Yeah, I'll even take it a step further and say it's one of my kind of biggest like worries when I see it in an organization is it even not just the technical system, but the product itself. So when you have engineers telling product people how the product works so that they can tell the other engineers like how to fix the thing, right? Like you've got a system where it's now both the product and the system are dependent on the engineers, and that it's like it's an imbalanced team.
yeah, that is weird, or not weird, but it's not a good. It's not a good place if the engineers are telling the product people how the product works.
They essentially have to reverse engineer the code to know how it works today. So then you get in a situation where if it's a bug, how do you know it's a bug? Like, is it a bug or is it a change? Like maybe the system never had that capability. Because I've had users, I'm sure we've all seen this, where you get a user report where they say, "Hey, I'm sure this feature was here last week," and what they're actually thinking is another software that they tried that's very similar that does have that feature. You've never had that feature, right? But the customer is convinced that they do. So, like a support rep might say, where is the feature? I've never seen it." And then now the customer is convinced that there is a feature and it doesn't actually exist. So you have to have somewhere to have that definition, or you end up solving support tickets that aren't real.
And they say AI hallucinates. I have recently had a thing where customers were complaining. I had a customer, ticket that the API was returning the wrong thing, or that it had changed. And I looked, I'm like, oh, well, good for you for finding this endpoint, because apparently we didn't document it in production, even though you could totally and should use it. And it looks like the thing that it returned, like it's returning the same thing it's always returned, but the thing it's returning is useless. Like it's returning a key that means nothing.
Right. Yeah.
So that was easy because it wasn't documented. I didn't have to not fix it because it's like, well, I don't want to change it. We've got a contract. There was no contract because it wasn't documented. So I'm very curious. So how well was that received? I mean, imagine like the product and the newer engineers were very receptive to being brought in, but was there any pushback or concern from the pillars of knowledge, the core engineers, about becoming less key to the system, or were they happy about it?
I'd say a little bit of both. I think there was a lot of relief in the sense that once they realized, oh, I won't be the only person on call for this app 24/7, like that's like a light at the end of the tunnel. But at first, just like with kind of any engineering team, or really any sports team, when you're, any team, when you're trying to kind of shape things up, there's some initial pushback, and, people kind of push back on just change in general. Like when you implement a code coverage check or a new, policy or something like that, people say, well, now I'm going slower and it feels like I'm getting less done. And it's like, well, we're stuck in a 3 or 4 month bug cycle, and I don't know if what you were doing before was working. So we need to change something, and then see how that kind of goes, and go from there. So kind of coming from that, like, good intention of like, we're just here to help and we're just trying to make a difference. I've seen this before. I know this works if you just trust the process long enough. And then once they start to see the results, then they're instantly bought in. And now everyone's saying, hey, this was the greatest thing we've ever done. I wish we would have done this sooner. We've got bug counts down. People aren't sitting in incidents, all day long. We have an incident response process, which, before it was just all hands on deck, which is a total interruption to
Yeah.
everything, which is another reason that they would get stuck, right? It's just efficiency loss.
Right. Yeah. The old go slow to go fast of, oh, but I'm running as fast as I can, but I keep hitting these walls. It's like, well, maybe if we slowed down
Exactly.
just a touch, we wouldn't hit walls, and then we'd go much faster overall.
Right.
So I'm glad to hear that the core people started buying in. Isaac and I did an episode a while ago, not that long ago, about uh, not what was it called? It was called coding yourself out of a job,
Mm.
not being a key person. Right? There's just if
Yeah.
you're and sort of the main thesis there was if you're too important and too key then to replace, then you're also too important and too key to promote. You're just kind of stuck where you are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, switching back to another thing you said. You were talking about the UX not flowing well and that adding kind of cognitive load and support tickets because customers didn't understand.
Mhm.
And then you said you'd made some changes and kind of that shifted. Were you able to see that in terms of like the number of customer service requests coming in? Or
That's a good question. We don't have, I guess, good data in that sense. Like from the engineering perspective, I'm sure we can get it, but we don't have it offhand. But we did have I guess anecdotal evidence from the support team saying, hey, requests are down. There's also a really strong Facebook community. So there's a lot of kind of quick feedback as, when there's bugs happening, we know right away. When they're happy with something, we know right away.
mm-hmm.
So yeah, we've seen over time the sentiment kind of shift, because when we first were getting started, you're kind of seeing, you'd see 100 spam emails went out on accident, right, from a cron that got fired several times or whatever. So like that leaves people furious. So you hear about that, that's the kind of feedback we were seeing in the beginning. And now we see a lot of like support, hey, we see how things are turning around. I love how the app is now so fast and usable.
Mm.
So we were kind of seeing that good feedback. So I think that's kind of how we're able to identify that. We also have a kind of North Star metric internally that we're using, not a number, but kind of a graph that we use of like bugs reported and bugs closed. As long as those graphs are going the opposite direction, then we feel pretty good.
Cool. Do you have any sense from the sentiment which hurts the company more, uh, bugs versus UX complaints? Like, if the UI is slow, that's not really a
It's sticky.
bug. Yeah.
Yeah. So the way I would describe it is, to the user, they can't tell the difference.
Hmm.
Mm.
I would say or I would even say like most users don't care about the difference. To them, like, right, like whether infinite scroll is just laggy, or infinite scroll doesn't load, or infinite scroll is just the wrong UX for the experience, it just feels wrong, right? So to them, they're
Right.
just like, hey, this is wrong. It's buggy. They'll either just bounce, churn, or refund, right? So that's how you'll know. I think it's hard to quantify from the user's perspective, like bug versus UX. But
Mm-hmm.
just from going through it, I think we've seen probably around 30% of the bugs are actually like UX problems. Whether that's like a problem with how the workflow is set up, or it's illogical, or just like, scroll bar doesn't work right in certain places. Like, and now there's just like UI bug. I would say that whole categorization is about 30%.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So that's a really good. Sorry, I was contemplating that. So instead of saying are bugs more or less important than UX, it's really customers can't tell the difference, and so any a bad UX decision, even if it works correctly, is effectively a bug, as far as the customers are
Correct.
concerned.
Correct. So we would, if you're kind of leading towards, well, how do you prioritize or judge value? We go
Yeah.
based on the prioritization of the workflows to the user, and then like also impact, right? So, or like effort. So like, how much effort will it take us to make the impact? If it's going to take 4 months, then we're probably going to go ahead and get someone on it and get started on it. But
Mm-hmm.
we're going to take the other lower effort, high impact workflows first. So for
Mm-hmm.
like some of the UX problems, it's like not a rewrite, but it's like a redesign of like how that workflow is going to work. So those are bigger projects that we can't immediately deliver value on. So what we do is we try to find a phased approach. So can we do addition through subtraction? Can we remove problems from the UX to kind of just stop the bleeding while we
Hmm.
figure out how this feature should actually work for the user and how they're expecting it to work. And then that will just naturally reduce several UI bugs and like operational support costs because they won't be coming in as often for that support.
Hmm.
The company also does a really good job with like documenting and training for the software. So that's another big cost for the business where if the UX is a lot more intuitive, we need less of that training for people to use the software and get value.
That's a good call out. I'm curious. We You mentioned it a few times just in passing, but you said the churn rate is down. It's the lowest it's ever been. Do you have
Yeah.
any like were there some major bugs that you fixed that seemed to really impact churn, or was it kind of just a cumulative effect of you fixed as the bugs went down, the churn went down, and you didn't try to do any fancy correlation?
I would say there is a little bit of both. I would say it's not totally tied to just the bugs. The bugs was definitely one part of it. I don't think there's a specific bug. I think this was a case of death by a thousand cuts. There were a few big reliability type things that I think we solved fairly early on that helped with the user trust. As that kind of went on, we didn't have any more of those bigger issues with like spam emails going out or duplicate charges. So prioritizing those like transactional
Mm-hmm.
workflows like charges, emails, SMSs, making sure those are really stable, I think was one of the biggest factors as far as the bugs go. But then I know the company was doing literally everything in its power outside of engineering to try to reduce that churn through like support. I know they implemented exit interviews during this time as well, which helped them get a better understanding of why people were leaving and then also
Mm.
turn some people not to leave and to just hold out a little longer, which I think some of those ended up staying. So that was a good way to do it. I think there was also a lot of different like value adds that they were delivering like into the inboxes, like through newsletters or kind of like
Mm.
one-on-ones, like white glove implementation services, different things like that the business was trying to do to just kind of hold as many subscribers on as possible. And I think that helped a lot too.
Awesome. So it was a death by a thousand cuts and recovery by a thousand cuts, but probably the most important single thing was just reliability. Making the system
Yeah.
reliable was probably more important than any other single action, but not still the majority. It's just the
Right.
single
And to my
most.
point earlier, that's to the users, it's still just a bug. Like they don't see it
Right.
as, oh, that's a reliability issue or that was an infrastructure problem, right? They're just like, that's a bug. It didn't work. I'm upset.
Cool. And so I'm going to ask a question that I'm going to make sure, or I'm going to try to make sure it doesn't reveal, because white label is obviously a pseudonym. But it seems like this is probably you're entering the high period for their business, right? It's summer in North America. They do a lot of work there. It should be cyclical, right? This should be the high point of the
Hmm.
year, and then it
Hmm.
will lower down into winter. As
Hmm. Correct.
do you Has that played any part? The cyclical nature, right? That this is now the high point.
Yeah.
Does that impact your planning at all? Like, are you
Yeah.
think, okay, we should work on stability now, and then as things pare down, we'll get into feature work or something else.
Yeah, it does. I mean, right now, regardless of the season, all we're focused on is the reliability and stability and like really stomping out the bugs.
Mm-hmm.
I think we still have, at least a few weeks, if not a month or two to go on that front. But we have picked up a small percentage of feature development. I would say it's in the vein, though, of making those UX improvements. So I think we kind of like, we know the next 3 to 6 months has to be the bug smash, the UX improvements, and then we'll start to get into like really more of the bigger feature development. But to answer your question, yes, the cyclical nature does impact us because even, going into like what'll be off season soon as the season starts to wind down, um, we have to decide what do we want to focus on before the next season starts. Because there's
Mm-hmm.
certain critical features that we didn't get to that are like start of season features that you would use only in like January or February,
Sure.
or even earlier. So if we don't have those features ready to go by the time they're pre-planning their next season, that's kind of the time that people are making their cancellations and changing softwares and trying new things because they're slow. So they're fixing all of the operational stuff that happened during the busy season so that when the busy season comes back, they've already solved those problems. So if the
Right.
software is one of those problems, they will cancel us in the off season. So there's really a big push to get everything ready for them so that going into the off season, they ended their season really strong and saw that the software is ready to support them going into the next season. So we'll definitely have to make sure that those start of season features are ready to go too.
Wow, that's a great call out. Yeah, I didn't even think about. Yeah, you're going to have the end of season, and then that's when everyone, if they're upset, then they might muddle through for the high season because they just can't
Right.
find the time.
Can't change it. Yeah.
But in the off season, then you'll get killed.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's so churn is the lowest it's ever been, right? But also people are in the swing of the busy season. They're not going to make a drastic change to their business right now.
Right.
And like I said, they're depending on the software. So like I said, we've got, still a few months to make a good impression. So we're really focusing on, we know that that's the core thing. A lot of the people that are subscribed to the software really believe in the vision and the direction. So as long as we can show that we can be stable and support their business, I think they're with us for the long term.
Awesome. Are there any interesting scaling or iterative things that you're doing that we didn't cover that we should talk about?
I think that there's, yeah, I mean, there's quite a few. I don't know if, Isaac, you'd like to talk a little bit about like the automations work and kind of the complexity around like building an automations builder in general and kind of the pitfalls that we've kind of ran into there.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, the automation sounds very similar. Like I guess I've seen it in a couple of different companies now. But the idea is that you can set up kind of like this if then flow.
right.
And there was one that existed there that had manual triggers. Like if you did something, it would automatically trigger what should happen during a setup. And there were some that happened during crons. Like crons would constantly be looking for things. So there's like different ways to trigger an automation. Essentially, some of them are automatic by crons running, or some like as soon as you went to a different page and you did an action, then you would force the automation to run. And these automations, there's different versions of them. There's like the automations V1, then there's essentially a V2 automations that's sequence automations for this thing that was built to try to solve a different problem. And then all of these are still kind of buggy in a sense. By buggy, I mean either literally the code itself is buggy from where you actually force start the trigger on certain pages, or buggy because the queries that run through the cron are not performant, so you end up causing some other issues, or buggy from the user's perspective in that they have come up with feedback, like infinite loops from the automations that they've created essentially. And that's what we kind of needed guardrails for, to kind of educate or at least remove the logical choices from being able to be created from this flow. And so there's these arguments of like we should burn the whole thing and rewrite it from scratch, right? For V3. And so there's like some initial pushback on this concept of like, before we try to make a V3, let's try to figure out what is this thing doing? Like, what do we want it to do? Let's characterize how it should behave. And also let's look at, like, out of all of the different types of start triggers and response things to that start trigger, are there some that are used more frequently than others? Can we characterize like 90% of the bugs are actually coming from the two start triggers that people use the most? Maybe we just look at that and fix those instead of trying to make this huge half a year rewrite, right? So obviously I'll push back on the rewrite, but the idea is just to get, if there can be some kind of characterization around how it should behave, removal of illogical choices, fix the main issues, then you don't necessarily have to go and think, here's V3, here's V4. And each time you write it to, you might add even more confusion because your legacy customers that were used to V1 that then had to learn V2 and now have to learn V3 are probably not going to be happy to be along for that ride.
Right, as Dustin was saying, the UX complexity there is a cost to it.
Yeah, and there's a time series nature to these automations too. So what some people will do is like generate the automation events for 2 years out. So now we have 2 years worth of events being created in the DB that the crons are now looking through. And if enough users do that, we've generated just tons and tons of extra data. And if they end up deleting and changing those, we now have to run delete ops on all those items. So there's so many things that I think can be improved in that system.
Awesome. Yeah, as you were talking about customers creating infinite loops, I was reminded that anytime you create any kind of programming environment for customers, they will eventually find a way to get you into an infinite loop and sync your system.
For sure. And one last efficiency call out too. We we're hitting the writer database with reads essentially, and hitting it with queries that were they didn't make sense. And when we looked at the queries, we were hitting we're trying to read like 1,000 times a second, and it was ended up being related to imagine whenever you look at your history of text that you've sent somebody, like on your phone. There's a page where you can do that. You can look at the history of all the texts that go out for different customers and that kind of thing. Because of iteration over time, where people started adding to some code, it ended up being the case that for every item in that list, we would fire multiple queries trying to understand, which conversations were unread. Like if you're the last one who sent something, that we were considering it read, but if they sent something back to you that you haven't marked read yet, it was considered unread. And so this was more of just a refactoring how the query worked. We actually were able to consolidate that into one query for the entire thing instead of looping, which was nice. This massively reduced the per second requests, and then we just moved it to the reader as well. And so once we had a lot of this refactoring done and some other things moved to the reader and some indexes added, you could see the CPU usage of the database massively decrease, and we're able to downscale our database instances by half.
Oh, wow.
Massively reducing the cost for those production instances. So it's another one where the customer probably doesn't feel that, right? But the company checkbook certainly does, yeah.
Right. We talked a little bit about throwing money at the problem, which works in burstiness, but you have to be able to scale it down at some point.
Right. So this bought us time to scale down.
Awesome. I think
there's a good topic there too about how to make developers aware of the costs of their choices.
Yes.
But that's a topic for another day.
Yes. Dustin, if people want to get in touch with you and your agency, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
Redhook.agency. There's a place there. You can schedule a call anytime.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, Dustin. I'm Jeffrey Sherman.
And I'm Isaac Askew, and this is Never Rewrite.